Good morning. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I'm the President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you all for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this virtual program on this very important topic of reopening California's schools. I think we're all looking forward to a very timely discussion on this critical issue today. This event is part of PPIC's 2021 Speaker Series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We would like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. The series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor to make more public programs like today's possible. More information is available at ppic.org. And finally, before we begin, if you have a question for the panelists, please send an email to the email address on the screen, including your name and organization along with your question. I know that Ricardo has saved some time at the end of the program to devote to questions. And I would like to introduce our distinguished moderator, Ricardo Cano, who covers California education for CalMatters, a nonpartisan, nonprofit journalism venture. Ricardo, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Mark, really appreciate the introduction. And I want to thank everybody who's taken the time here to spend their lunch hour with this conversation. Certainly a lot of news today. As we speak, the legislature is debating Assembly Bill 86, which we'll certainly get to. Wanted to start off by introducing our panelists for the hour. Joe Boyd, the Executive Director of the California Teachers Association, is here with us, as is Suzanne Kitchens, the President of the California School Boards Association. And also with us is Ron Williams, President of the Association of California School Administrators, each representing a branch of the folks who decide locally on issues pertaining to reopening school campuses. And so we're lucky to have them here. And so I think, let's start off with the big picture question here. How ready are California schools to restart in-person instruction? And what is the biggest challenge right now to doing so? And let's start with Suzanne.
Okay, first of all, I think it's important to note that the school reopening discussion didn't start with recent legislation, and neither did the work to return students to the classroom. Contrary to some common narratives, school districts and county offices of education have been diligently preparing for in-person instruction during a time of great uncertainty, inadequate support, and insufficient guidance. Under adverse conditions, school boards have guided the transformation of school districts into food distribution services, healthcare providers, technology service firms, and childcare centers in order to support students during this time of crisis. It hasn't been easy. It has never been done before, but schools have been resourceful in providing unconventional ways for students to receive education and support during the pandemic. Schools have purchased cell towers, mounted hotspots on buses, negotiated with telecommunication companies to provide internet service for low-income families. They have revamped buildings, installed new ventilation systems, erected partitions, purchased masks and other PPE, developed testing regimens, and undertaken dozens of other measures to address the impact of COVID-19. And the term reopening is a misnomer in many cases. Not only have schools been providing distance learning, many school districts have been open for months, some of them since October. So the biggest hurdles as we move to the resumption of in-person instruction have been inadequate resources, inconsistent and insufficient guidance, lack of staffing, differing perceptions of what constitutes safety, lack of access to vaccines for educators that can address differing safety concerns. Recently, of all the factors preventing more schools from reopening, the biggest factors have been the winter surge and the lack of access to vaccines for educators, two problems that seem to be decreasing in severity. The bottom line is that the governance teams have been building the plane as they go along, finding solutions to problems, but one problem they didn't have the ability to solve on their own is vaccinations. Now that we are seeing more and more teachers vaccinated and community spread is receding, you've seen increasing numbers of schools open and make plans to open in coming weeks. As community spread is decreasing and vaccinations are increasing, the opening of schools will continue at an even higher rate. This happened before the governor and legislative agreement. What this proves is that schools were always working to open and trying to get students back in the classroom as soon as possible, once it is safe to do so.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. And Joe, let's your take here. How ready are schools to open, and what's the biggest challenge to get there?
Yeah. Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks to PPIC. Really appreciate this invite today. Just to echo Suzanne's point, all of our schools are open, and really our educators have been working under a kind of stress and hardship this year that's unlike any year in my 30 years in education. Be that in person, and many schools are in person, be that hybrid, or be that distance learning. More are opening each day as the virus infection rate decreases. And that's hugely positive because that's where everybody wants to get back to. But there are a number of challenges. Again, Suzanne referenced some of these that I would certainly agree with. The most immediate, of course, is vaccines. Getting vaccines for our educators and everybody working in schools. Super happy to see the governor change course a little bit on that a few weeks ago. And then, of course, the announcement from President Biden a few days ago, those are very positive. And then second, getting vaccines into our hardest hit communities, because that's where the spread issues are the most severe. And so it seems like the governor is making some news as we speak around that. And that while that may be very positive, I also saw that there was some references to changing the tiers. And quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure about the increase in vaccinations and how that relates to the tiers. This is news that's breaking as we speak. Quite frankly, it would seem to possibly undermine AB 86 a little bit. So, some of you are probably able to follow that in real time right now. Given that I'm on screen, I'm not. But let me say this, I think the biggest challenge is actually something different. I think it's twofold. One, it's just the virus and what happens with it. Do the vaccines work? Do the variants overcome the vaccines? And so that's the first one. And then the second one, I think it's actually us. I think it's us as a community. If we want our schools to open fully, we want them to open in person, and we want them to stay open, then that means that as a community, we're going to have to be vigilant to keep the spread low. We're going to have to stick to mitigation tactics like masking, distancing, cleansing, testing. It means an increase in our communal support for a cause that's bigger than us as individuals. Many of us on this call know Peter Schrag, and he's written eloquently over the years about this move away from communitarianism in many forms in our state, including public education. If the virus rebounds and there is a fourth surge, we're going to get to see if he was right or if we're able to row together. Because at that point, it's going to take all of us rowing together to keep our schools open and protect the most vulnerable among us. Because the bottom line is the virus is in charge, and this conversation is really about that, and it's really about the safety of our communities. So I think, really the biggest challenge is, can we and will we act collectively to stop it?
All right, Joe, thank you for that. And Ron, wanted to get to you. What are your thoughts here?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the comments by Joe and Suzanne. I think their perspectives so very important, especially when we've got about a little over 6 million students in the state of California. And I won't repeat what's been said, but I think that, the number one priority is obviously the safety of our students and staff in our communities. I know that over the last couple of months in particular, the infection rate and the positivity rate has been declining. With the funds that were received prior to the end of the previous academic year, a calendar year, most districts went out and purchased all of, PPE, everything from staff masks, face covering, desk shields, putting in spacing, hand washing stations, gloves, plexiglass dividers for staff, electronic attendance and temperature equipment. And a number of associations have also signed off MOUs with their districts, including ours. And the symptom screening, I think that, we've put most districts have put in as many interventions as they possibly could to address the issues that we have at hand. And, it's one thing to put them into operations, it's another issue to implement them. And I think that everyone, either through their distance learning or some form of hybrid, is looking forward to operationalizing the practices that we've put in place over the past 6 months to a year, and to see the difference that we can make for our students. It's specifically when we have our students and parents in communities wanting their students to return to school in person or in some hybrid format as quickly as possible.
Right. And so I want to get to the news of the hour right now. The legislature is still debating Assembly Bill 86, the deal to incentivize more schools to offer in-person instruction this spring. It seems like it will pass, and the governor has said he will sign it. But we also, the governor's office also announced last night that the state will soon be relaxing requirements for counties to reach the red tier, primarily by raising the case rate from 7 to 10 positive cases per 100,000 residents. And so how this could potentially mean that by April 1st, in order to get that $2 billion of grant funding, schools would have to offer in person to students in transitional kindergarten through 6th grade and at least one full middle or high school grade. There's a lot in this package, and I'm just wondering how far will the legislation and these potential changes to the red tier go toward offering more in-person instruction to students? And is there anything in the changes and in this legislation that you feel would inhibit those efforts? And let's start with Joe.
Well, it's a little hard to unpack what the governor did last night. I'm not sure, how the legislators are feeling about that, especially given that there's elements of AB 86 that are directly related to what red tier and purple tier actually means. So changing the meaning of it that we're all trying to work under, it is a challenge, and it potentially changes the meaning of the legislation itself. As far as the overall legislation goes, one of the big issues around vaccines, there was huge movement on that, really independent of the legislation, as we referenced earlier. So sort of stripping that out, because that was moved early and independent of the legislation. I guess I'd give it a solid C. The truth is, there's a lot of this that's that has to do with saying that we're doing something when in truth, and Suzanne mentioned this, a lot of that's going on right now anyway as a result of where the virus is. At its core, it's a spending bill, and it's an important spending bill. The $4.6 billion, which is going to really help with what kids need around enrichment and everything that they're going to need to help support their learning, is critical. The $2 billion in so-called incentive money, that's problematic, and it potentially is hugely problematic with what we're hearing now with the changing in the tiers. Because the reality is, I don't know what the right word for it is, but if the hardest hit communities are unable because of COVID, not because of how hard they're working, to take advantage of the funding, then that seems unfair. And so it seems like, at least on that element, fairness and equity lost out. I guess that's what I'd say. I mean, I think of a lot of districts, but San Diego in particular, they seem to have done everything right. District seems to be working with their labor partners. They've got, an incredibly complex population to serve, yet for no good reason, they're gonna lose a big percentage of this money. And that just doesn't seem to make sense. But the reality is, school districts are gonna open based on what's going on with COVID more than what's actually in this legislation. So, yeah.
And Ron, your take here on the impact of Senate Bill 80 or Assembly Bill 86 and these changes that were announced last night to the tier structure.
Well, that gives additional flexibility. Obviously, with the 10 as compared to 7, that's going to give us specifically administrators a little bit more flexibility, as well as districts. Based upon the research that I know that I've had the opportunity to review, I'm in a high school district, which is 712, but I know, just looking at the elementary school districts, if you've got 20 students or 30 students there, you've got one adult, you've got one teacher, 25 students. The challenge comes in when you come into secondary schools, where you have students moving every 47 or 56 minutes with a new cohort. And that's really a major challenge. Obviously, the distancing, specifically in a hybrid model, I think it's going to give districts a little flexibility to be able to slowly push up the operationalizing component of a hybrid. And I think that will make a significant difference for them. I think that as administrators in particular, we're very, very pleased with Senate Bill 86 in its existing language. And we had some challenges with it before, and we're very, very appreciative of where we are at this particular time.
Gotcha. And Suzanne, how about you?
I agree with what's been said as far as the bill is concerned. For the most part, we're happy that we've been moving in a better direction with this bill. But I think all three of us continue to see areas of concern. And I think we've been kind of showcasing that in the last few minutes. Relaxing a tier, I think it goes back to what we all represent. We represent many, many different kinds of school districts. And so relaxing a tier may mean something to one school district and something completely different. So it goes back to, unfortunately, the virus is in control. So it tends to not work, and it's a disadvantage for school districts who may be facing challenges already. And the more that they have to do to try and reopen with vague terms, flexibility is great, but continuing to change as we're trying to build our planes is not the best way to try to reopen schools. So I think for all of us, we see that it's a benefit, this bill, but there still remain a lot of concerns about what isn't available and what we need to keep our schools open, but continue to keep them open into the out years. So it's a very difficult challenge we're facing, and this bill is addressing some of it, and we are grateful, but we will continue to voice our concerns in various areas that will help our students and our whole learning community of people, teachers and everyone included, to continue on that trajectory. It's not a simple 1-year fix. And I think that's what's going to come out as we talk more and more about our challenges.
Right. Thank you, Suzanne. And as has been mentioned, most schools have remained in full-time distance learning this year, but there have been some public schools in California that have been open for some form of in-person instruction as early as August, mostly under hybrid learning. And I'm curious, what have we learned or taken away from these schools about how safe in-person learning is for teachers and students? And to Suzanne's point, what is your own definition of what safe is? And I'd like to start with Ron.
Well, we have schools in our local community that have been open for an extended period of time. And I know across the state, you have different districts, different communities with different positivity rates and infection rates. And it's not a one shoe fits all. When we look at, for those schools that have been open, we haven't seen a significant uptick in the positivity rate or infection rate in those districts in our local communities. I think school districts do an excellent job of communicating to their parents and their communities. And I think that many individuals in the community truly trust our schools to be advocates for them in regards to safety. And in the districts that I'm familiar with in particular, they have been very, very successful in doing some form of hybrid or in-person effectively, to the point that their positivity rate and an infection rate did not go up significantly as compared to the rest of the community.
And Suzanne, how about yourself?
I think, again, with what Ron is saying, you could take a snapshot across our state. And the problem is, it is the virus that is controlling what is happening in each of our local areas. And so some of us have been successful in keeping our positivity rates where they need to be. Others have no control about what is going on. And so I believe that with the vaccinations and with our ability to help with our community spreads, all of it is starting to decrease. And so I think until we can control the virus, whatever we want to do independently in our school districts is still going to remain whatever's in our region and what we're allowed to do and what tier we're in, depending on what they change. And what we want to do is keep in that positive direction of keeping the schools open, which means we'll continue to do what we need to do to keep everybody safe, teachers, students, our surrounding communities. Because the one thing we don't want to do is have to go backwards after opening, because for students, for parents, and for teachers and everyone who support teachers, not a good thing. So the goal is to open once, continue that trajectory again. And I think as long as we do what we need to do and vaccinations continue and our community spread continues to decrease, I believe by the beginning of the new school year, we should be in a really great place, as long as we have the recovery methods in place for the summer, which we have the money for.
And Joe, what have we learned from the schools that have been operating in person in terms of how safe it is, and what does safety ultimately mean by definition?
Yeah, I agree with what Suzanne said, and one of the reasons the push has been so hard around vaccines is that assuming that they work against the variants, and let's hope so, is that's kind of an equalizer, because there is inconsistency, and I know that there's this narrative, and that schools can open if you just do these safety protocols, distancing, ventilation, testing, PPE, and that's all in place. But the position's premised on the assumption that all local schools are able to offer all of those things, adequate ventilation, spacing, and et cetera. But what we know is those conditions vary widely from school to school, conditions to conditions, the age of the building. There's a lot of our folks, teachers and students, they're in rooms that have no windows, one door, that opens to an indoor hallway. So they, in essence, have no access to fresh air, which is one of the key things to safety. And credit to PPIC, they just put a report out, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, that nearly 40% of students attend schools that don't meet the minimum facility standards, and 15% attend schools with extreme deficiencies like water damage, power failures, and structural damage. And it also went on to say that COVID-19 has brought additional challenges as many schools do not have sufficient building space, adequate ventilation, and cleansing supplies. And I'm quoting directly from the PPIC report. So while we've got thousands of kids back in schools and all these safety measures are called for, they are inconsistent. And we've got to accept the fact that you don't just suddenly, change an entire building, especially as it relates to big ticket things like ventilation and space for kids. And those are huge safety measures. So, until all the educators, all the people who work in schools, and ultimately the older students are vaccinated, we're not going to have the consistency we need, at least as long as this virus is still with us.
Right, and getting on the question of safety, I know that we're talking about the spring right now, but another big question that is on the horizon that the legislature and the state is going to have to figure out is what things will look like in the fall. This year, the legislature passed a blanket kind of exemption that allows schools to maintain their funding and do full-time distance learning. It doesn't appear like there's going to be an appetite to do something like that again this session. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, understanding that there are months between now and August and September, but what should students, teachers, and parents be expecting come fall next school year? Should they expect a full 5-day return to in-person instruction? Joe, I know that you just finished, but I'd like to start with you.
Look, this depends on a lot of things. Again, I guess I'll go back to where I started. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I've got some ability, or any of us have some ability to understand what will happen with the virus. So if the virus, the variants and whatnot are, we all get inoculated or get the vaccines and it's effective, then I think that's going to put us in a really good place to do those things. And in addition to that, if we as a community can row together and really take the steps that we need to do to keep this under control by wearing masks, by doing not just the things that we need to do in schools, but in our larger communities, then I think we have the possibility of being okay. If we don't do those things and we have a fourth surge, which is entirely possible, then I think it'll be a struggle. But we have a lot of work to do. Look, right now, we don't even have the data transparency in schools to know exactly what's going on. And so to fight something like a virus, we've got to have the data available. We've got to have the asymptomatic testing. Even before vaccines, there was that path forward with asymptomatic testing and transparency and all the other mitigating factors that was there. So we've got to step up our game in those areas. And Suzanne and Ron mentioned this, but that really, in large part, depends on this larger system support around schools. Schools aren't designed to do those kinds of things. And so that larger support is important. And I got to say, not moving the goalposts all the time. We've changed the meaning of what it means to be in a tier now 3 times. For better or for worse, the governor has generally made the definition of how, when, and where to open schools. Schools haven't done that. Unions haven't done that. That's been defined unilaterally by the governor. Even the legislature really hasn't done that. So at some point, we have to have some consistency of what to expect, because I think everybody at the local level really wants to make this happen as soon as we can and as effectively as we can.
Thank you for that, Joe. And I just wanted to do a quick reminder here. We are going to be taking questions from the audience. And so if you had a question for our panelists this hour, do send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So with that said, let's keep going. And Suzanne, again, what should we expect come fall?
I think it's reasonable for the parents of the students and the communities that support our students that they believe we're going to do our best to make it as close to a fully implemented, whatever each local area decides, reopening, in the fall. But the problem is, without knowing and not having a crystal ball, I believe we can do it. But all the stars have to line up. And clearly we're not in control of that. And it goes beyond just us as teachers, as administrators, as school board members. It's everyone in our communities who have to buy into this thing is killing people, and we need to do the steps we individually have to do, as well as school board members, administrators, and teachers. So I believe it's possible that we'll get as close to a more traditional, what you expect to see, but only if other people beyond this group of people are doing the right thing as well. My biggest concern is what I've seen after a year of watching our teachers, our professionals, our communities, and yes, even school board members work so hard to get to this point where we're ready to start reopening our schools fully in the fall, without the recognition of legislators and governors and others that this is not a one-year recovery plan. We must commit as communities and the people who have the power of the pen to ensure that these students who've already lost a year do not lose any more, because our future does depend on them getting the best education and the best educational outcomes. That means we unfortunately have an opportunity right now to help those that are most at need, because we have no structure right now and we're starting from zero. So let's do it right. Let's make sure that those who have those additional needs, that we somehow find the way to make that happen. So I believe it's possible, as close to traditional reopening, but keep in mind, whatever restrictions they put on us, those restrictions make it impossible for most schools to change any configurations they have, which means you may have blended learning, whatever that is for your local area, because you just lack the space. So you can't do more than X. But I think for the most part, I hope parents, the students themselves, first of all, will be happy that we're going to try and do recovery, whatever that means over the summer, continue it as we move forward. But the most important thing is to understand that what has happened in this last year, just like a financial meltdown, it took us years to recover from the last financial meltdown. For students' education and their future, we can expect no less, that we will continue to press. This is a multi-year recovery, and that's what I care about, because it is their future, and it's our future because they will be the ones that come after us. So that's what I'm betting on.
And Ron, as a local school superintendent, certainly will be in the thick of the logistics for your district. What are you expecting for the next school year?
Well, I agree with Joe as well as Suzanne. Unfortunately, none of us have crystal balls. However, when I at the end of this previous year, when we had our seniors that participated in virtual graduations, talking to parents, initially that was just like so awful. And, because at that time we thought, okay, come August of 2020, we would be back in school. unfortunately, it just went on and on and on until at this particular point in time. And, as I talk to students, parents, they all want their students to, return to school as quickly as possible, but they want them to return, as mentioned by Joe and Suzanne, in a safe environment. The social distancing is a challenge. We have to look at the fact that classrooms were basically built to carry about 30 to 35, 36 students in it. And when we're talking about in some type of a hybrid mode, whether 25%, 50%, or 75%, it's going to be a challenge to locate students, be able to house those students in our traditional classrooms. Also, when we're looking at transportation, our buses, we normally have buses that can carry 50, 60 students. When we're looking at social, those are other factors that we have to look at. In a hybrid environment, I think that we can have some version of probably 25% each 4 days a week. And depending how we monitor the spread, and if there's any type of a spread, I think that we can scale up as time permits. So I'm optimistic that in the fall, but I think that we're going to all get an opportunity to field test some of our assumptions at the end of this month, the 1st of April. And I think that if we can field test a number of our assumptions at the end of this academic year, it will put us in a much better position to start the fall in as greater number of students enrolled in our schools as possible.
Right. And so thank you for that, Ron. I know that this debate has been fraught in some communities, and there's certainly a passion from parents who do want to see their student and child be in person, as well as parents who and folks who don't think that's the best decision. And so in the light of all of this, we have heard concerns from some parents about the state's pace of reopening, thinking California as a state is going too slow, too cautious. And we have seen that frustration play out among some of our state legislators, with Assemblyman Phil Ting recently calling local control a complete failure. And so I just wanted to get your response to, whether you feel the state and the governor should have had a more hands-on role in terms of determining the when to reopen, the how to reopen, and whether you think the criticism about California not moving fast enough to reopening schools is fair. And so let's start with Suzanne.
I think part of the problem is what I think we've all addressed. Unfortunately, when you use like local control, it's kind of not fair to say that we have control, meaning the local communities, because in fact, a lot of what we must adhere to is generated from someone outside of our communities. So we may want to do something, but there may be things that prevent it. So I think that's one of the disconnects for most people, that we don't get what we need, but we might have restrictions on things that we need to do. And I think it's that disconnect. So if you're looking from outside of our state, you probably ask, I don't understand what the problem is. But for any parent who's come to our local school board meetings and advocates for something and then watches us go through an entire meeting, they walk away basically dumbstruck going, my gosh, this is what you're trying to deal with. And that really is, I think, a big piece of why all of us who are trying to reopen have different answers. Yes, we have local control, but I don't believe that's a fair way of looking at us as local communities. We have control over what we think and what we think should happen, and we all differ on what we think is safe and all of that. We are in agreement, but the problem is there is a distance between what we want to do and what we're allowed to do. So I think where governors and legislators, and we do, especially board members, talk to people in charge of education and explain to them what it is you do to us every time you change the conditions, because we have real people that we're trying to get a cohesive answer for. And mostly that's what parents, our communities, our teaching, and all the professionals want. We want some clarity. So I think it's fair to say we have local control, but I also believe that unfortunately in our particular case, we don't have a lot of control over a lot of what we must adhere to, which causes a lot of our problems. So I think for most people who work outside of public education, they need to understand that a dollar is not a dollar. A dollar may be only good for 1 year, and they change the rules on us as we're trying to work through a year. So I feel very strongly that I think overall, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an administrator, whether you're a school board member, vast majority of us are trying really hard to meet the conditions to reopen. I think sometimes the message is we're not able to do what we should do, versus I think we need more collaboration with legislators and the governor so that we can do it correctly, efficiently, and keep it moving into perpetuity, basically.
Right, and Joe, your response here.
Yeah, you know, I mean, look, sometimes it feels like we have this discussion about schools reopening as if there isn't a pandemic going on. You know, I really believe that the vaccines have the potential to change this situation, this scenario, along with the drop in case rates. But when schools aren't open, it's generally due to community spread of COVID-19. You know, it was only probably 6 short weeks ago that we were in the deadliest spike of the virus, and we were we had one of the highest infection rates in the country, and we were talking about you know, our emergency ICU rooms not having space for people and ordering more body bags. And you know, so that was just at the beginning of January, so that wasn't too far back. Look, I mean, you know, again, for better or for worse, the governor has set the terms of what the tiers are, what the tiers mean. That's changed a few times. I actually think that local school districts, you know, and their communities and their local unions have tried to work under the guidelines, and I think with few exceptions, they've actually done pretty well. They've actually laid out some pretty good plans that are carrying forth right now. In fact, you know, when schools have remained in distance learning, it's largely been because there was a collective decision that came, you know, with the school district, with the local unions, and with community partners, not some other way around. So yeah, so I get it. I think sometimes we forget that everybody in schools, teachers, educators, bus drivers, nurses, counselors, school secretaries, principals, I mean, they've been working their butts off during this time. They've been trying to make schooling work under the most difficult circumstances that could possibly exist. And in many cases, many of those folks have their own kids. So it's not as if they're not parents and they're not feeling this same pressure. They are. You know, that this idea that we want schools to open, but we also want them to open safely, and we want them to stay open. We don't want to open our schools and then have to circle right back around and close them down in 6 weeks because we didn't put the safety mitigation in place. I think we're going that way. We're already there in a lot of schools, and we're going to get there, get more schools as we move forward.
Right. And Ron, your response before we move to audience questions.
Well, you know, in a number of our schools that we have distance learning going on, we have teachers and classified staff that's coming in each and every day. In fact, they're delivering the distance learning in their classrooms. You know, we also have to deal with the fear factors with our students, parents, as well as our staff as well. I think that as a result of this pandemic, our traditional educational system will never return to 100% to what it was before. I know in our particular case, we've implemented virtual academies because we have some students that learn and prosper very, very well in that environment. And I think that we have to become greater entrepreneurs of meeting the needs of our students and their different learning styles.
Right. Well, thank you all. We have some questions coming in, and so I want to get right to them. I just want to start with this one because it is directed to Joe specifically. Joe, you spoke about the need for a more uniform approach to ventilation. Are you supporting labor partners who are demanding ventilation standards greater than what is recommended by the CDC and other health guidelines, even when those demands could mean delaying school reopenings?
I mean, I suppose I'd have to know the specifics of what that ask was or what that demand was. Without knowing, it's a little hard to answer that question. But I will say this, that while the vaccine is I think a game changer, I also think that ventilation is also one of those things that is both the most difficult because it really involves sort of capital changes in the buildings and structures. And it's also one of the biggest problems going in. Remember, we're paying in some cases for not being attentive enough to funding and supporting things like our school buildings and ventilation for many, many years. And now we're paying a big price in the middle of this pandemic. But the idea that we send our kids and our folks who work in schools into buildings that were already having inadequate ventilation before this ever started, is a shame. And now that it's so obvious with COVID here that this isn't acceptable, hopefully it spurs us to get us to where the ventilation standards should have been all along.
Right. And just briefly here, just wondering, a question from the audience here. What will contact tracing look like in schools? I know that some schools have been doing that while in distance learning, but will schools have tracers to investigate cases? So Ron, this is your area. What can you share with us?
Well, even beforehand, we've been dealing with contact tracing because, we've known a number of our employees that contacted the COVID-19, not work related, but we still followed through, contacted everyone that they had been in contact with. And so we have that in place. We do our temperature check each and every day when they come in. It's done electronically. And so I think most districts are very, very comfortable with the contact tracing. I know in each one of our schools, we have a room that's dedicated in case if a student or staff comes in that's exhibiting symptoms, we'll be able to isolate that person there. And I think that most districts have become very, very efficient at contact tracing because we've been doing it for the past year. And so I think we're okay with that.
Thank you for that. And so another audience question here. Panelists have mentioned that the case rates set by the governor are determining when schools open, but we've seen instances where schools have not opened when they had that opportunity, notably in the Bay Area before the winter surge. What do the panelists think the disconnect is between the state guidance telling districts when to open schools and the decisions by schools to not reopen, and how should that be solved? Suzanne, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because I think one of the problems is when you can have guidance and you're right, the communications can sometimes leave school districts with options that really are hard to, each school district is allowed to do what they want in terms of how they handle, as long as it's within the broad guidelines. So I don't know in that case if it's better to seek stronger guidelines so that it becomes a little less likely that people misinterpret. As you just said, if everything's green, like you're in let's say, out of purple, and you know that X. I not a legal person, so I don't know how you deal with that. Other than, I guess, within the community, if you know you need to open, you come and make your case that these are the green lights. What's the deal, basically? I'm not quite sure what the question is, other than local control means local control, and maybe better guidance would make it clearer to school boards what they should be doing. I think that's about the best I can say on that one. That's a difficult one.
Sure. Anybody care to offer some perspective there in terms of?
Yes, I would. Oh, no, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I just was going to briefly say, I think President Biden kind of hit on this a couple of days ago when he talked about, it's not just about, this guidance, that guidance, that it's also about how, whether you're talking about a teacher or you're talking about a community member, it's how people are feeling, and are they feeling confident in what's going on, and the school's preparedness to handle a situation. There's plenty of places, and I'm not just speaking about the Bay Area, where when the governor changed the tiering, the requirements the first time, it moved it to 14, and there was some surprise that everybody didn't run to open. Well, everybody didn't run to open because they weren't feeling confident in the situation on the ground. And in the Bay Area in particular, with the timing you suggested, let's be happy that they didn't, given what happened in the 6 weeks after. And it turns out that they probably made a pretty darn good decision given the spike or the third surge. So I think it's not just about what happens when someone changes a letter or a number or a color. It's also about what's really happening on the ground and how people are feeling about that.
And Ron, you wanted to add something to that as well?
Yes, and I think another factor that we all need to take in consideration is public health. The governor provides guidance, public health, and going from one county, there's 58 counties in the state of California, and many of them were in the purple. The majority of them were in purple, but we had some counties that was very few positivity rates, and it could be because they were geographically challenged, but there's other factors that come into play. It's just not a school board, administrator, or teacher issue. There are other factors beyond the three of us sitting here that we have to all consider in our decision-making process as well.
Right, and there's a question here from a viewer in San Diego regarding, again, reopening, but the viewer says that panelists continue to state that we cannot return to full-time in-person instruction until we get the virus, quote unquote, under control and implement extensive safety measures like improved ventilation. But science and data indicates that schools can and should be open even when we do not have the virus under control, and with only basic safety measures like masks and 3 feet of spacing. The question that the viewer poses is, why do you think that California schools are not capable of physically reopening in these circumstances when we've seen other schools across the country that have been doing so for months? And I know that, how about we start with Suzanne?
I guess for me personally, I try really hard not to compare schools that aren't located within our state with other states, because I don't know the circumstances on how those states are able to operate. What I do know is within any geographical location, a region like my region or Ron's region or anyone else, there are so many variances within that region on how they get their funds and how they're able to utilize their funds, that I think it's unfair to say that we don't want to reopen. I think going back to, it's a community's ability to feel comfortable moving into the next phase. And I don't think any of us can make that decision for any other local entity. It has to do with that community surrounding. I still say we all want to be open, And most of us spent a lot of time last summer gathering volunteers in reopening plans that we're implementing. Some of us were able to open since October. Not everyone's been at that place, and it goes back to where you were when you closed and where you can start to reopen. So I understand that makes it sound like we're reticent to open. It's more about we want to open and stay open, and then we want to continue to look for ways for resources to help us with our recovery as we move through the next few years. So.
No, thank you for that, Suzanne. Joe, your thoughts here to the question from the viewer. Oh, you're muted, I think.
I was the first one to screw that up today. I'm not sure exactly what the listener is referring to, because quite frankly, I don't know of guidance that says if you just have masking and 3 feet of distancing that it is safe. I haven't read that guidance. I have read the guidance that says if you do the full thrust of distancing and 6 feet is the common standard, masking, ventilation, contract tracing, asymptomatic testing, and cleansing, that yes, in fact, schools can and should be able to open safely. And that's not something that we've contested, and nor do we. And as Suzanne and Mark have said, that is where we want to be. We want to be in that place. But let's keep in mind too that a lot of schools across the country have opened and closed. A lot of schools across the country are unable to get are having staffing problems because people aren't willing to work under certain conditions, and including substitutes and regular teachers. So I think you got to be careful when you compare what's going on in, say, Georgia with California. Maybe it's a good comparison, maybe it's not.
And Ron, did you want to add something here?
Yes, I just wanted to sit down and say, I know specifically that our certificated staff has just been phenomenal in this process. We have a signed MOU, as well as our classified staff and our board as well. We've been working collaboratively for the students, families that we serve within our communities. And one of the things that I would like to share with everyone is that we would love to have all of our students back. As we do student forums, parent forums, community forums, we hear what our community is asking for. We would like to have them back, but we would like to have them back safely.
Right, and I think we have time for just one last question here from the audience. And this is from a viewer in Benicia. What is your response to the fact that there are more private schools in the state that have been able to physically reopen compared with public schools, and haven't reportedly experienced many issues on that front? What do you make of the private public divide that we've seen throughout the year? And Ron, I know that you just finished, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts here.
Well, in a number of the private schools, and this is not all, a lot of them are independent study private schools. The student may come in for a short period of time. It's a difference when we're talking about a comprehensive school, specifically a high school in which a student is going to be there 6.5 hours, 4 hours. Then there are probably some activities, athletics, etc. When a student is coming in for 1 hour a day or a couple of hours a day, that's a totally different framework as compared to when students are coming in for the entire day. Yes, there are some private schools that are open, but we need to look at their instructional model rather than just saying because they're open, we can have students coming in to our independent study school, but they may only come in for 1 hour or 2 hour a day. It's a difference when you're having the student is coming in for the entire instructional time for that particular school.
Sure. Well, I wish we could get to more of this, but obviously we're reaching the end of the hour here, and so we have to wrap up. And I just want to thank all of our panelists for participating in today's conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've been able to carve out. I know that there's a lot of things going on right now, so thank you. PPIC would also like to thank the sponsors of this event, And finally, thanks to all of you who took some time to out of your day to join us today online. If you pre-registered for this event later today, you're gonna get a survey, and I know that PPIC would appreciate your feedback. Please be safe and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.